If it's Thursday, breakthroughs, bombshells, and Biden. It's been a day of action in Washington, at the White House, and in Congress as leaders in both parties navigate a series of storms, literally and figuratively. Plus, Ukraine is alive and kicking, but it needs American help. That was the message from President Zelenskyy in a historic speech to Congress as the U.S. prepares to send more money and more weapons to the front lines. And Americans across the country are battling a triple threat of illness from COVID, flu, and RSV. How to face a season of sickness with one of the top medical experts in the country. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander, in for Chuck Todd, and at this hour we are awaiting remarks from President Biden that the White House is billing as a, quote, Christmas address focused on what unites us as Americans, his optimism for the year ahead. Of course, one of the biggest questions in politics in the year that we've witnessed centers around President Biden and whether he'll use the bully pulpit like he is today to navigate a Republican House majority coming up for the first time in his presidency. Speaking of Congress, the Senate just this afternoon passed that $1.7 trillion government spending bill, a process that's highlighted some of the deep divisions inside both parties as they brace for leadership shakeups in the new Congress. It's now going through some administrative hoops in the House, where it is expected to pass later this day. Here's Senator Chuck Schumer sending the bill to the House and sending the Senate to the airport to make their holiday flights just before the vote.
This is one of the most significant appropriations packages we have done in a very long time. The range of people it helps is large and deep. After a lot of hard work and compromise, the Senate is funding the government with an aggressive investment in American families, workers, and national defense. This will be the last roll call vote. A Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year to one and all.
As we follow developments today with President Biden and Congress, we're also tracking developments tied to the former president, Donald Trump. Right now, we're standing by for the January 6th committee to release its final report that was originally scheduled to drop yesterday. We were expecting it earlier today. We are told that it could come at any minute, and if that happens, we'll be ready. The January 6th committee has released a number of deposition transcripts from various figures in former President Trump's orbit, including a former top White House aide, Cassidy Hutchinson. Her testimony has raised allegations of potential witness tampering by Trump allies. We're going to have a lot more on that in a moment. But the bottom line here, the headlines that we are tracking right now have one significant thing in common. They reflect the key questions facing our politics as we head into 2023. For Donald Trump, will the deluge of bad headlines and investigations make him too toxic to be the Republican Party's standard bearer once again? For President Biden, will he find a way to continue his string of accomplishments and settle on a new list of priorities for 2023? And for Congress, will this ugly spending bill fight be a preview of the interchamber and inter-party quarreling to come when Republicans take control of the House just a couple of weeks away? NBC's Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill for us. NBC's Gary Grumbach is outside the White House as we anticipate the president's remarks. And NBC's Ken Delanian is watching the latest with the January 6th committee. Sahil, let me get to you quickly. A lot of back and forth, some concerns this wouldn't happen at all. And all of a sudden you got a $1.7 trillion omnibus that looks like it could happen before the end of this day. How did we get here?
Well, Peter, the Senate did pass by an overwhelming bipartisan vote the $1.7 trillion omnibus spending bill. The final vote was 68 to 29, winning over more than enough Republicans to clear a filibuster and move forward. It now goes over to the House, which is expected to pass it. How did we get here? This is a product of months of negotiations between Democrats and a group of Senate Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, who were willing to play ball on this. The reason Republicans were willing to do this deal and provide the votes is that they got a boost in military spending above domestic discretionary spending. That was a big carrot for them. It breaks that Democratic demand of parity between the military and non-military budgets that they've insisted on for years. The bill also includes a major rewrite of the Electoral Count Act, that 1887 law that former President Trump and his allies tried to exploit to keep him in power, even though he lost the 2020 presidential election. Essentially, what this new provision in this omnibus bill does is it looks at all the things that Trump and his allies tried to do and tightens those loopholes, closes them, so it makes clear the vice president, doesn't have any power whatsoever to discount electoral votes. It raises the threshold to object from one member of the House and Senate to 1/5 of each chamber. Just those two things would have prevented January 6th if they were law. And in addition, of course, there's $45 billion in Ukraine aid, which, not ironically, not coincidentally, I should say, comes one day after President Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke to Congress. So how did it happen? There was enough willingness in Congress to get it done, but these are the closing days of the Democratic trifecta. Next year, it's House Republicans in charge of that chamber, and it's going to be an entirely different ballgame, Peter.
And that's really the story. The three-word question, I think, right now is, can they govern, right? All of a sudden, you're going to have the House Republican Speaker, likely Kevin McCarthy right now. You've talked on the Senate side to Mitch McConnell recently. Was this omnibus process sort of a preview of what sorts of fighting and flashpoints we could see coming up in the new Congress?
It absolutely was a preview of the divisions between House Republicans and Senate Republicans. McConnell and McCarthy were very much at odds here. McCarthy fought till the bitter end to torpedo this bill. Still is, I should say. He's probably not going to succeed because Democrats have the votes to carry this in the House. But McCarthy tried to stop this bill and argue that it should be punted to the next Congress while Republicans are in charge, so they can basically rip it up and rewrite it. McConnell had other ideas. Now, McCarthy, it's not even clear he can get elected Speaker at this point. That's the most basic thing you need to do before you organize the House of Representatives. And that fight, Peter, more than anything else, is an indication of how challenging it's going to be for House Republicans to govern. Not only do they have this wafer-thin majority that would be difficult under any circumstances, they're also facing down a Democratic Senate, a Democratic president, who are not going to go along with the things that the far right, which is very emboldened in the House Republican caucus, want. How McCarthy finds his way out of that dilemma remains to be seen. I did talk to Mitch McConnell, and he acknowledged these disputes, these disagreements that he has with McCarthy, and he said McCarthy has, quote, a difficult hand to play.
Yeah, we're going to be watching as he tries to play that hand. Of course, he's still got to earn the speakership, which isn't done just yet. He may have to wait through Christmas for that to happen as well. Gary, let me get to you, if I can, really quickly at the White House right now, my normal perch there in Washington. As we anticipate the president's remarks, he's hoping to use this as sort of a Christmas list of checked items, what he has achieved over the course of the last year, and express new optimism for the year ahead. But what priorities is the administration focused on right now, and how confident is it that he can get anything done when all of a sudden the Republicans are controlling the House?
Yeah, don't call it a victory lap. That's what we're told this speech is not going to be, according to sources that are telling our White House team. It's going to be much more of a celebration of the accomplishments of the past 2 years, from the Inflation Reduction Act to the Infrastructure Act. But that was the past 2 years. The next 2 years are going to look very different. It's part of because of what Sahil said. With a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, there's going to be a lot of gridlock on Capitol Hill. And so the next few years, especially next year, there's a lot of uncertainty as it relates to the investigations that are going to be going on into Hunter Biden, into Dr. Fauci. This is what all the Republicans say they're going to be doing in this next year. There's also the uncertainty of the economy and what that's going to look like. Prices have been all over the place about everything in this past year. Who knows what the next year is going to bring? And then, of course, when it comes to the Ukraine war, this is another big topic. The amount of money that we're giving to Ukraine is likely going to change dramatically in the next Congress. So there's something to look to there as well. And then the big question, will President Biden run for re-election in 2024? We may get some hints about that today, but we should be getting a decision on that within the coming months. Peter?
Yep, no doubt this is going to be something the family will be talking about over the holidays as the Bidens gather up again. Also, Hunter Biden facing some real challenges as Republicans promise that they're going to be looking into him as well. Let me get to Ken, if I can. More January 6th committee documents are trickling out as we await that final report. Among them, what we're seeing right now, the transcript of Cassidy Hutchinson's interview. Obviously, she was that incredibly brave young woman who worked basically as Mark Meadows' right-hand woman, who witnessed so much taking place inside the White House and heard some of those anecdotes, some of the stories being recounted, had some of the exchanges that are so key here. What did she say, according to these transcripts, about the pressure campaign against her?
Yeah, Peter, we're learning really sort of two major lines of revelations from the transcript of her full testimony, which is the extent of the efforts to influence her testimony, both from a spokesman for Mark Meadows, who, according to her, called her the day before she was due to testify and essentially said, we know you're going to do the right thing and help out the boss. And then by the lawyer that she first engaged, actually was engaged for her, a pro-Trump lawyer named Stefan Pasentino. And she says that he essentially told her that it was okay to say she didn't recall information even when she did. She painted a picture of a lawyer that was really trying to minimize and influence her testimony in a pro-Trump direction. He has now taken a leave from his law firm, although he says he did nothing wrong. And then the other major strain of revelation from this is just the extent to which she is testifying that Mark Meadows and others had conversations with Donald Trump where Trump acknowledged that he lost the election. I cannot stress how important that is for the Justice Department as they weigh a prosecution in this case, because it's one thing to have people like Bill Barr testifying that they told Trump that the allegations of fraud were bogus. Because Trump can always say, look, I disregarded that advice, and I was listening to other people like John Eastman who were telling me there was fraud. But when you have people like Mark Meadows allegedly saying that Donald Trump said, for example, on December 17th, he knows it's over, he knows he lost, but we're going to keep trying. That is powerful evidence of criminal intent to the Justice Department, who, if they're going to allege that Donald Trump knowingly tried to defraud the country, essentially, and push forward these bogus allegations of fraud. Now, again, this is Cassidy Hutchinson testifying third hand. You really need to hear this from Mark Meadows. But given all the evidence around Mark Meadows and attempts to potentially influence witnesses, there are a lot of legal analysts now speculating or wondering whether Mark Meadows is cooperating with the DOJ in this investigation. His lawyer is declining to talk about it, Peter.
Well, there's a couple things to chew on right there, right? First, Stefan Pasentino, this is the attorney that was assigned to Cassidy Hutchinson, effectively pro bono, being paid by others, reminding he was the White House ethics lawyer in the past, and he's the one who said to her, we're just going to downplay all this. You're going to claim you didn't hear anything I don't recall. It's really remarkable if you read through this transcript. And separately, the point you make about criminal intent, that's been the real challenge for the Justice Department to this point. So there's a lot for us to keep an eye on of what just broke already, even as we await the final report. There are some other transcripts, Ken, that we got last night, including a lot of Trump world figures invoking their Fifth Amendment rights to just about every question that they were asked. Who are we talking about, and what does that tell us?
Roger Stone, for example, invoked the Fifth Amendment to questions about what's your name and what's your date of birth. What's interesting about this is that, everyone is entitled to assert their Fifth Amendment rights, but the DOJ has tools to get around that. For example, they can immunize people and then compel their testimony in front of a grand jury, because many of these people are not on the hook criminally. So the DOJ may well immunize them, drag them before the grand jury, and make them talk. So that's an example of where the Justice Department has greater tools. The January 6th committee just ran up against a wall of opposition from Trump world, people who are just going to assert the Fifth Amendment in answer to every question. And so there were a lot of questions they didn't get answered, but the Justice Department has the tools to circumvent that, Peter.
Ken, we're going to let you work. As soon as that January 6th full report comes out, we're going to hustle back to you. If that happens in this hour, we'll make sure to get you live here as well. So, Hill, let me ask you again quickly about some news that you've just heard as it relates to the House vote on that $1.7 trillion omnibus. When could we see that vote happening?
Well, Peter, we are now expecting it to happen tomorrow, probably 9 a.m. or after. There was hope of doing it today, but House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer just said a few moments ago that the Senate process took much longer than they expected, and they do not believe that the House is going to vote on it tonight. So the House will begin processing it. They have to run it through the Rules Committee, which takes a few hours, then set up a little bit of debate on the House floor. But unlike the Senate, which takes unanimous consent to do just about anything quickly, the House can get this done in a matter of hours. It looks like that will be tomorrow morning, Peter.
Yeah, of course. A lot of those House members already home, which means they don't have to sit through this awful storm that's coming to the East Coast right now. Sahil, Gary, Ken, thank you so much. And joining me now for more on this incredibly busy holiday political week is Republican strategist Doug Hay, as well as former Maryland Congresswoman and NBC News political analyst Donna Edwards. Appreciate you guys being with us, and an early Merry Christmas to each of you. Doug, nothing like the smell of jet fumes and the threat of winter weather ahead of Christmas to get Congress, certainly the Senate, into gear on the omnibus. Looking at how this spending package went down, what are the things that you see here that give us indications about what a divided Congress is going to look like in the new year?
Well, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, the division between Republicans. And, I was at the farewell speech that Senator Richard Burr gave Just last week, I know Congresswoman Edwards was at an event for him a couple of weeks earlier, where he said when he first came to Congress, he was told the people on the other side of the aisle are your opposition. The people on the other chamber of the Capitol, they're your enemy. And that's true whether you're talking about Republicans and Democrats or Republicans versus Republicans, Democrats versus Democrats. They don't always have the same priority. And so some of that infighting may be a real sign of what we see coming up, not just over the next couple of weeks, but as we move over the next 2 years.
Donna, you served in divided government. What are your expectations for the next year? And obviously, President Biden's going to have real challenges as he tries to accomplish more going forward. But now it's House Republicans, likely under the leadership of Kevin McCarthy, who have a lot more power.
Well, I think that the important thing for Democrats is to stay unified, because they're going to have a really strong opposition to things that a Republican-led House will try to push through. I think the challenge for Republicans, as I had experienced it, is that Republicans are really all over the map. And I think it is, with this narrow majority, it's going to be very difficult for Kevin McCarthy to, maintain all of the ships in the same sea. And so I think it is going to be difficult on the one hand for Republicans and for Democrats just staying unified in the face of that opposition. My experience is that Democrats have been able to do that and really push the buttons of some Republicans. And what we're seeing coming out of these new members coming into Congress is that they are in a completely different place than the mainstream of the Republican Party, if there is still a mainstream.
And Donna and Doug, as we speak to you right now, to our audience watching, you can see President Biden delivering his remarks on what they describe as the cross hall right in the center of the White House residence. If he makes any news in the course of his remarks, we will share that with you. Again, he's expected to be touting many of the White House's accomplishments over the course of these last 12 months. Donna, just one more follow-up to you, if I can, though. We know the omnibus funds the government through September. We also have the debt ceiling expected to hit likely in the spring months of next year. How ugly is this going to get as we relate to that potential cliff?
Well, it could be really ugly. We've seen in the past where Republicans have tried to use the debt ceiling as a cudgel, and no surprise that they'll try to do that again. And then with spending, even though spending expires on September 30th with the new fiscal year, that means that Republicans are going to have to set up their spending priorities going into an election year, and I expect that that will be difficult as well. But this debt ceiling coming up is going to be a surefire confrontation in the factions of the Republican Party.
Doug, is Kevin McCarthy the next speaker? I mean, what's taken so long? I think some people will say, obviously, this is an indication of the challenges they face right now. You got Kevin McCarthy threatening to tank all Senate Republican bills in the House if they agree to the spending package, right? He's still wielding a lot of power right now, but he still doesn't have full support within his conference.
Well, I think everything that he says right now should be in that context of the January 3rd vote. You don't get there until you have that vote, which, as the Congresswoman knows, is one person at a time, if they're in the chamber, voting on a person by name. So there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot of drama, even in votes where who's going to win. When we knew that John Boehner was going to win in 2013, for example, Nancy Pelosi dealt with this as well. Obviously, as Kevin McCarthy is trying to get there, right now he's demonstrating to his caucus that he's a fighter. And we can argue whether that's the best posture to make if you're the speaker or not. But that's the posture that the conference wants to see by and large. And as he's trying to go back to his old role, he has to go to his old job of being the whip to get the new job as speaker. That's what he's demonstrating right now. He's whipping them by showing what a fighter he is.
And Doug, Kevin McCarthy says the House Republicans are going to take politics on the road. They're going to be holding hearings at the border, they say, as it relates to the issues over the asylum seeking, the migration crisis that we've witnessed taking there right now. Is this all to be seen through that lens as well, right? Really just to speak to the base and ultimately to some of the farthest right wings of the Republican Party?
No, actually, in my whole career, I've been a big proponent of what we call field hearings. And that's when you take Washington, D.C. out of the Capitol and you take it into those communities that are impacted. And you can do that at the border, certainly, but you can also do that on every committee, whether it's the Small Business Committee, the Science Committee, the Agriculture Committee. You take it to those areas that are impacted by the policies that are created in Washington and then obviously regulated in Washington. So you hear from the people directly. It's a lot easier for Washington to hold a hearing sometimes in those communities than it is for people to get to Washington to allay those concerns. So I think it's a good development. Democrats should do more of this. Republicans should as well.
Donna, Joe Biden has a lot that he's going to be touting as we hear his remarks over the course of this hour. What are his biggest challenges as the new year comes, obviously with eyes on 2024?
Well, look, I think that President Biden got a lot of his priorities passed, and I think this is going to 2023 is going to be a year for implementation. So you will see the president and his team out on the road for infrastructure projects and for the funding priorities that are going out into communities. And I think this is going to go a long way to touting his accomplishments as he goes into 2024. But look, there's not going to be a legislative year really for Democrats or for the president.
Yeah, as one senior official at the White House said to me recently, it's an opportunity to show your dollars at work, a way that the administration is trying to capitalize on past successes, even if there aren't a lot of new ones to be had over the course of the next year. Doug and Donna, we wish you both a very good holiday. Thank you so much. Appreciate your being with us. And we want to turn now to the weather. Once in a generation, that's how forecasters are describing this monstrous winter storm barreling down on the country as we speak. Look at these pictures. This is Chicago. The National Weather Service says the storm is expected to produce potentially crippling impacts across the central and eastern U.S. More than 100 drivers were stranded just east of Rapid City in South Dakota last night amid dangerous whiteout conditions there. Go to Denver. You're looking at snow covering the airport there. Temperatures dropped 60 degrees in 24 hours. Nearly 2,000 flights have been canceled ahead of the Christmas holiday weekend. And as the massive storm moves east, it is expected to rapidly intensify and what they call a bomb cyclone. I'm not a weather guy, but you know that's not a good thing. Nearly 115 million people are under winter weather alerts. Blizzard warnings affect portions of 8 states right now. All that color along the eastern seaboard is going to make things really complicated for people trying to get to their loved ones. And there is all the cold we're witnessing across the Midwest. One of the biggest concerns right now, the winds there causing the power outages as temperatures drop to dangerous levels. You got the governors in Kansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, Georgia, Oklahoma, and North Carolina, all of whom have already declared states of emergency. And here's Kentucky's Governor Andy Beshear with a warning this afternoon as his state braces for the extreme winter cold.
Even with all the extra stuff we do to it, won't work to prevent ice if we have certain conditions out there. So everybody expect the roads to be treacherous tonight through tomorrow, probably through most of Friday at least. I don't want to lose one person due to this cold. But, folks, if we don't take it seriously, we will lose loved ones.
Kentucky's dealt with too many tornadoes now, the potential for another crippling storm coming that way. This one, the cold. We're going to keep our eyes on the storm throughout the hour. But up next right here, President Zelensky's powerful wartime plea to Congress. I'm going to speak to a Ukrainian lawmaker on how her country is responding to Zelensky's trip, the commitment of $45 billion that appears on its way, also the message it could send to Vladimir Putin. That's next.
Against all odds and doom and gloom scenarios, Ukraine didn't fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking.
Welcome back to Meet the Press. Now, after his historic and dramatic trip to Washington, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is now back in Ukraine. On his way home, he stopped in Poland and met with the Polish President Duda. Zelenskyy called his trip to the U.S. his first known trip outside Ukraine since Russia invaded his country 10 months ago, a success. In addition to being warmly received during his joint meeting before Congress, Zelenskyy also secured delivery of a Patriot missile defense system, something he's been asking for months. The Russian ambassador to the U.S. called the White House's latest pledge of military assistance, quote, provocative. And a Kremlin spokesperson says the trip proves Zelenskyy and his American allies are not, quote, striving for peace, I'm joined now by Kira Rudik, a member of Ukraine's parliament in Ukraine right now. Also with me is Ambassador Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and now an NBC News international affairs analyst. Kira, I want to let our audience know that you're speaking to us by generator because where you are right now has no power, so that's your only way to keep the lights on and to communicate with us. So we're grateful that you're able to be here. I want to sense on the ground there across Ukraine, what is the reaction to President Zelensky's trip here to Washington and now what appears to be the U.S.'s commitment of another $45 billion in assistance to Ukraine?
We are bursting with pride, and it's incredibly motivating and uplifting for Ukrainian people seeing President speaking to U.S. Congress, meeting with President Biden. Just imagine a year ago, it was unspeakable, and nobody could even think that something like this can happen. And right now, not only we see President being so warmly welcomed by U.S. people, we also see the confirmation for the Patriot missiles that we were asking for since the day one of the full-scale invasion. You know, we are all looking for the turning point in this war, and we want to hope so much that this is it. Because the Patriot delivery to Ukraine is a huge symbol to all our allies that we can get these weapons and that we should receive more and more sophisticated weapons from them, defense systems that we need so badly. And this is why it is so important and gives us not only hope that the next year will be safer for us, but also a hope that our goal to win this war next year is achievable.
Kira, what does it tell us all about the status of the war in Ukraine that President Zelensky, after 10 months, felt comfortable enough to leave the country? You'll remember early on in the February days, just as this war was getting ready to start, U.S. intelligence reportedly asked him if he wanted to get out, suggesting he should leave the country, and he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. What's it say that now he's comfortable leaving the country and flying back home?
Well, he's comfortable because he knows that we all have his back. We have an incredibly strong army right now that is fighting and making Putin lose at the battlefield. We have incredibly strong community and unity between people. Unity is actually our superpower, that we are holding together no matter what challenges the everyday is bringing. And we all know that no matter happens, we will be pushing towards one goal. And that's why President is comfortable to go and do this extremely symbolic gesture, traveling all around the world and saying, watch who our allies are. Watch that there is no Ukraine fatigue. Watch the whole world. We are on the path to win.
Kira, let me ask you one last thought. And I was in the news conference there with President Zelensky and Biden yesterday and on the South Lawn as he arrived here at the White House. The question that I was curious to ask was, is there any diplomatic end to this? Which is to say, is Ukraine willing to accept an end to this war without getting back Crimea, in addition to those provinces in the eastern part of the country? Can Ukraine accept that conclusion?
We want to take back all our territories and restore our sovereignty to 1991, because we are a sovereign country, and what happened to us is extremely unfair. But the bigger question is the security guarantees after the war, because that will answer all your questions. What are the guarantees and who is going to provide them that Putin would not attack us again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow after so-called peace deal? And before we figure out this way, before we figure out this configuration, there is no talking about Crimea, no talking about like any configurations, because it is clear that right now we are the only ones who are stopping Putin at his path to conquer the world with, and our allies are helping us.
Kira Rudik, we are so grateful for your time and your perspective from there, and we're mostly glad that you're safe and wish the best to you and your family. Ambassador McFaul, let me ask you, if I can, very quickly about this. As we've seen new reporting, especially from eastern Ukraine right now, where Volodymyr Zelenskyy was on the front lines now just 48 hours ago, the Russians have changed their strategy in some way, putting more forces up front, which experts suggest may make it more challenging for Ukraine to regain some of the lands that it has lost. Is there any potential for a diplomatic solution here? Does this end in some kind of stalemate? What is the end of this thing? How does it come to a close?
Well, first, right now, there isn't a stalemate. Both sides believe that they can achieve offensive capabilities in the future, right? They both are planning for offensives. So until those conditions are not ripe on the battlefield, I see no possibility for a negotiation. Second, however, the Ukrainians are constrained. They do not have, in their estimation, the kinds of offensive weapons that they need. Tanks, fighter jets, long-range missile systems, these ATACMS, to go on the offensive. And they're worried about a Russian counteroffensive coming as soon as next month. So that's the conditions they're in. That's why Zelenskyy came to America, came to meet with President Biden first to talk about those things, and then came to speak to all of Americans to talk about why it's important to stay the course.
And Ambassador McFaul, as you know well, President Biden yesterday made it very clear that the U.S. is not providing those offensive capabilities. They're giving the Patriot missile defense system because, as he said, it is a defensive weapon. In his words, if Russia wants it to stop being used, they should stop attacking Ukraine. The Russian embassy, though, they called yesterday's announcement a provocative step. It was stressed that the provocative actions by the U.S. are steadily leading to an escalation, the consequences of which cannot be imagined. That was the statement that was shared from the Russian ambassador to the United States. Do you worry about the Kremlin's response to what it views as an escalation?
Well, of course I worry, and of course that's the job of the President of the United States and his team to worry about escalation. But we need to have data about it, right? First of all, why do they need Patriots? Because Russia is bombing their cities. When Russia wasn't bombing their cities, they didn't need Patriots. Patriots are a defensive weapon. But second, even more importantly, I think, we've heard this threat of escalation all the time. They're doing everything they can to fight the war in Ukraine. They're not constraining themselves. So why should the Ukrainians constrain themselves? And secondly, if we're talking about escalation towards attacking NATO, if you're barely fighting, you've lost 50% of the territory you took in Ukraine, you're barely holding your own against Ukraine. Do you really think Putin is so irrational that at that moment he would escalate and attack NATO? I don't believe that for a second.
So you said that obviously the mindset on both sides is that they can take more gains. They can have more gains there. The Ukrainians, as we know from Volodymyr Zelenskyy, want those offensive weapons. They're not getting them right now. Without those offensive weapons, are they able to win this war?
Well, I'd say two things. One, they could do it a lot more quickly if they had those weapons. And that's Zelensky's argument, right? We want to end this war as fast as possible. This helps us to end them. Number two, without the weapons, they're still going to keep fighting. I think there's this misperception sometimes here in the United States and in Europe that if they don't have the weapons, they won't fight. That's not just true. They're going to keep fighting. Third, the question you were just talking about, the question you wanted to ask the president about negotiations. Number one, that's a question for Zelenskyy, not Biden, right? That's not for us to judge. But number two, remember, even if Zelenskyy might someday in the future think that it's in his national interest to not try to take Crimea, he would be a fool in terms of negotiating with the Russians to mention that now. I negotiated with the Russians. I negotiated when I was in the government. You don't give away anything until everything has been negotiated.
No, I think you're exactly right. And to be clear, that is the question I wanted to ask President Zelenskyy as I was conflating my presidents there and asking that question of you earlier. Ambassador McFaul, always good to see you. We wish you a great holiday season. Thanks so much.
You too. Bye-bye.
Up next, I'm going to talk to the Congressman Mike Quigley, co-chair of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus, and one of the members who escorted President Zelenskyy into the House chamber last night about whether the new Congress may mean no new funding for Ukraine. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we mentioned a bit earlier, there is a good chance that right now you are in the midst of, or certainly about to face, one of the most powerful and widespread pre-Christmas winter storms in a generation. The storm is going to bring dangerously cold temperatures to roughly 143 million Americans from as far west as Colorado all the way to the East Coast. Blizzard conditions are also expected between now and Sunday for much of the upper Midwest and Northeast. The storm has already dumped several inches of snow in Wisconsin and Illinois. Those pictures from Madison earlier today. It's forced airlines to cancel more than 2,000 flights today nationwide, with additional cancellations expected again tomorrow, all during what is one of the busiest travel weeks of the year. And joining me now is the Illinois Congressman Mike Quigley, whose district includes part of the Chicago area. He's also a co-chair of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus. Congressman Quigley, having spent my college years in Chicago and having been the child of Chicagoans, I know you guys get tough winters, but this is a really messy and ugly several days that you're facing with some frigid temperatures ahead. What's it looking like outside right now?
Yeah, it's coming, and Chicago, as you know, can handle it. If this was happening in the city you're at, it'd be paralyzed for a month. But having said that, this is very dangerous, and people need to take care. I'm particularly concerned about those who are homeless, those who have to work outside, and they have our gratitude. And it's a reminder we always like to give this time of year. When it gets that cold, just because your pet has a fur coat, it doesn't mean they should be out there for an extended period of time. Watch out for them, too. So this is a dangerous storm.
It's a good reminder as you look at it. I'm just browsing my phone right now, and it says that tomorrow morning when folks wake up in Chicago, it's going to be -9 degrees, and that doesn't include the wind chill, which whips off of Lake Michigan there. So it's going to be awfully cold. We also have some pictures we can show you from Southwest Michigan, Benton Harbor. Shaq Brewster, our colleague, has been driving through the mess that's there as well. Let me ask you about Ukraine, if I can, another country where the weather has been weaponized, in the words of President Zelenskyy and President Biden right now, with Vladimir Putin trying to plunge that country into the depths of cold and darkness right now. You were with President Zelenskyy yesterday. Any chance to speak to him?
I reminded him that we spoke at length in July when I was in Kyiv about how the war was going and what Ukraine needed to move forward. So we didn't have as long a time yesterday, but he was pumped up, I think very enthused. And we talked a little bit about, the aid package and our thoughts about its chances of going forward. And finally, I couldn't help, as a member who formed the hockey caucus, I asked him, a good Ukrainian has got to play hockey. And he said, not since childhood, but he thinks he still could if he had to.
Yeah, I'm guessing the Blackhawks could use a couple guys on the front line, right? So let me ask you about this new tranche. It looks like the $45 billion are going to get through the House, likely with that vote coming tomorrow morning as part of this giant omnibus. Do you think this is the last tranche, as we describe it, the last sort of U.S. aid that's going to be approved for Ukraine, with the Republicans taking over the House come a couple weeks from now?
Well, look, I think one of the reasons it's so big and it's happening now is that to make sure that there isn't a gap there because of some difference in opinion. But let me say this. The vast majority of the Democratic caucus favors an ongoing effort to help Ukraine to ultimate victory. But I still think the majority of the Republican caucus feels the same way. There's a rift there. It's I guess you'd call it the Reagan wing versus the whatever you want to call the newer wing of the Republican Party. Clearly different than Reagan and much more isolationist. But I think that, let's just say we didn't do this. I still believe if push came to shove, the Congress would have ongoing support until ultimate victory.
Congressman Quigley, what do you say to those Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, likely the next Speaker of the House, saying that no more blank checks for Ukraine in the new year? He expresses that reservation, as have others, in even tougher terms on the Republican side of the aisle, because they say, the U.S. could be facing a recession coming up right now, and this is effectively a case of misplaced priorities, where the money shouldn't be going to Ukraine, but should be going to some domestic priorities at home. Why is that wrong?
Yeah, first, we can do more than one thing at a time. The war in Ukraine is helping Ukraine. It's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. You know, I thought it was particularly helpful when President Zelenskyy referenced FDR's speech after Pearl Harbor and quoted from it. You know, I thought he quoted from the wrong speech because FDR's last inaugural, I think he said the essence of why we fought in the Second World War and why we should help Ukraine now. He said, we have learned that we cannot live alone at peace, that our well-being is dependent on the well-being of other nations far away. If anyone imagines that Putin would have stopped at Ukraine and not gone to Eastern and Central Europe and threatened others, that the core of our allies, and that Beijing wouldn't be looking at Taiwan and saying, well, this will be easy, you know, the West won't come to their aid. So there's a lot at stake here, asking ourselves why we fought the Second World War. Unfortunately, it's much of the same turf and for many of the same reasons.
Yeah, yesterday's speech by Volodymyr Zelenskyy, a lot like that of Winston Churchill back during the Second World War this month, 81 years ago. Congressman Mike Quigley, we wish you a very Merry Christmas, a good Hanukkah to all those celebrating in the Chicagoland area. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
After the break, Sam Bankman-Fried makes his first appearance in federal court as prosecutors try to untangle one of the biggest financial frauds in American history. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back to Meet the Press Now. The man accused of being behind one of the biggest financial frauds in American history, FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried, is now back in the U.S. The crypto exchange CEO appearing in front of a judge in New York this afternoon. It has now been released on a $250 million bond. Before being extradited to the U.S. late yesterday, Bankman-Fried spent 10 days in jails in the Bahamas after his arrest on charges including wire and securities fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Meanwhile, two of Bankman-Fried's top business partners, the company's co-founder and the CEO of the Associated Hedge Fund, pleaded guilty to fraud charges yesterday. NBC's Ron Allen is joining me now with the latest on all of this. So what happens as we look forward, and where is Sam Bankman-Fried now, Ron?
We believe that he is on his way to Northern California, where his parents live in Palo Alto, and they had to co-sign for this bond agreement, this $250 million. It was noted in court that Bankman-Fried's finances are greatly diminished, to use the word used in court. So his parents essentially co-signed this loan, and he's going to be under house arrest in their home with an electronic monitoring device and a lot of restrictions. He has to stay in Northern California. This was striking to many watching this. The prosecution suggested this proposal because they said in part that he had cooperated, he had not fought extradition, he had come back from the Bahamas where he lives and where he was arrested, and over the last couple of days he has been saying things indicating that he wants to make this right by the investors, that he wants to, that he is showing some remorse or contrition, if you will. But the bottom line is he's free for now, still facing charges that could send him to prison for life, and the next court date is January 3rd.
So for the sake of those investors, Sam Bankman-Fried says he wants to make it right by them. You know, you talked about Bernie Madoff and the effort to claw back a lot of this money in the past, right? This is familiar in some ways to some folks, though this wasn't a Ponzi scheme. Do any of those investors, do they ever see any of this money, or has it all just disappeared?
That's a good question, and you might want to ask a crypto expert. The whole industry is somewhat opaque, if you will, and I think that's one of the literally $8 billion questions. That's the amount of money, the amount of currency, the amount of whatever, Bitcoin, 8 billion, I should say, with a B, that's missing and it's unaccounted for. So we're talking about huge sums of money, and whether or not that will ever be accounted for is one of the big mysteries of this incredibly complex and broad financial scheme.
Yeah, so many big and famous names that were associated with FTX, from Stephon Curry to Tom Brady as well. A lot of investors putting a lot of trust and a ton of money into that. Ron Allen, we appreciate your reporting. Thank you so much. And still to come right here, COVID concerns on the rise as healthcare workers battle a triple-demic of flu and RSV and COVID just in time for the holidays. I'm going to talk to a doctor on what to expect and how to prepare next. You're watching Meet the Press now. We're back here on Meet the Press now, and as millions of Americans, at least the ones who are not stuck in the winter storm, are traveling this week to be with loved ones, coronavirus cases and deaths are back on the rise, with a daily average of cases and deaths going up by double digits in the past 2 weeks. A good reminder to families hitting the road right now. And conditions have worsened significantly over the last month. Our data shows that cases have gone up 80% since Thanksgiving. According to the CDC, only 16% of Americans 18 and over have received the updated bivalent booster to protect against new strains of the virus. Only 36% of people 65 and older who face the highest risk for COVID complications have received it. At the same time, Americans are also battling what we have been calling this triple-demic, a nasty combination of COVID, the flu, and another respiratory virus that is known as RSV. I'm joined now by Dr. Michael Osterholm. He is the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. He was also a member of President Biden's COVID Advisory Board. Dr. Osterholm, we appreciate your being here. Your reaction to these latest COVID numbers, and what does it tell you about the current state of COVID in the U.S.? Where are your biggest concerns right now? I mean, anecdotally, we are seeing this all over the place again.
Well, I think, first of all, Peter, if you take a look at what's happening in the United States, that gives you one glimpse. But when you compare it to what's happening globally, it's clear that the virus is coming back. And it's what we've been talking about for some time, that this virus continues to mutate, it continues to change. And with that, we can expect to see quiet periods where case numbers go up. And I think right now, none of us can tell you in the next 2 to 4 weeks what it's going to look like. It surely could increase substantially, as is in some countries around the world, and we have to be prepared for that.
It goes unsaid that, masking up and washing hands is going to help here. But what is the best advice to those who are returning to be with their families? I feel like a year ago, the deal was you had to take a test in some families before you even walked in the door here. What should folks do to try to keep themselves safe right now, given the fact that this thing can incubate in your body for a couple of days before you even get that positive?
Right. We're all trying to adjust to this stage of the pandemic and what it means. I think the first and most important thing to say is please get your booster dose. That vaccine will not necessarily protect you from getting infected or, for that matter, even becoming ill. But it has a substantial protection against serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. So that's really important. It's not too late because whether it's in early January you get exposed or later, you still will have the protection. It's too late to be protected for Christmas. What we do, and it seems to be working well, is just a very simple process. If you're having Christmas together, getting together, number one, nobody comes who's been exposed to somebody with COVID in the last 3 days that you know about. Number two is if you have any symptoms that day, I don't care if it's a sniffle, you can't come. And number three, test. Use the home test. And so far, people have been very successful in stopping transmission, even in get-togethers, if they use those three simple steps.
Doctor, talk to us about the flu. I was talking to some doctors in Rhode Island just a couple of days ago. They said that their ER was full, 100% capacity with adults and kids right now. There are a lot of flu concerns in a lot of the country. Obviously, some of these other viruses, even the common cold, making a comeback after a couple years, where it was off our radar. We were so focused on COVID right now. How serious is flu as it relates to families? RSV, I'm hearing, is actually coming down. So the flu may be the other big problem.
Well, Peter, I think we've actually had a narrative on the flu and RSV that has not been accurate. And I think that there's been, in some ways, almost hype around it. If you actually look at what's happening, we had a much earlier flu season. And that's true. We haven't seen that in 20 to 30 years. But if you actually look at the numbers of cases, I think we're going to have an average flu year. And this is exactly what was seen in Australia, in South America, and South Africa during their winter season this past summer. Early flu season looked bad initially, but just as we're seeing RSV and influenza come down, I don't think that it is, in fact, nearly as challenging. Now, what is challenging, yes, the hospitals were overrun. The story I think much of the media is missing is our healthcare system has become so underserved and capable that that's the problem. Pediatric beds have been retired out of cost. 30% of the beds in hospitals right now are being taken by people who should be in long-term care or step-downs, but there's nobody in the community that has long-term care beds available. When you add this all up, and the emergency rooms today have become mental health holding clinics. So it's the system's challenged, and if this were happening 5 to 10 years ago, yes, it would be stressful, but wouldn't be as stressful as it is right now. So yeah, be concerned, but I think you're going to see in the end, flu will not have been much more serious than any average flu year.
You make an important point. I'm going to bring that thought back to our newsroom. That's a story that we should be covering, and I'll suggest it going forward, the changing face of those ERs and hospitals, given the situation for them as well. Dr. Michael Osterholm, we're glad to see you. We always appreciate your advice and expertise. Thanks, and thank you for being with us at this hour. We're going to be back with more Meet the Press now, tomorrow. NBC News Now continues with Lindsay Reiser and for Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.